Welcome to The Aftermath, a podcast that rips the Band-Aid off the collective scars of divorce, custody battles, and the trauma of family drama. Kindra Reiber and Mick Smith pull back the curtain and explore stories that put the heart-wrenching puzzle pieces together with inspiring stories, notable experts, and actionable tips. Let the healing begin. Well, welcome once again to The Aftermath. This is Mick, the Doctor of Digital, and Kindra Reiber, our legislative advocate. Kindra, how are you today?
I am fantastic. How are
And
you?
what do we have planned
You?
today?
You know what? I think we're gonna actually fireside chat and talk
Oh,
about
fireside.
our last yes. You like that term?
Sure. Historical reference. I love it. FDR. So, yes, this is our follow-up session, the He Said, She Said segment to our guest, the attorney panel. And who did we have? We had Rick Julius, who's a senior litigation partner for Cordell and Cordell. He is based in Pennsylvania, a state that I know and love very well and had a little story about. And Marcie Patton-Coffman, who is also a senior litigation partner from Cordell and Cordell. And she's from where, Kindra?
Oh, I think maybe my home state, Ohio.
Ohio. Okay. Well, those are very interesting states. So let's talk about this and chat about that episode because that was pretty phenomenal. I think. What do you think?
Yeah, you know what? I think sometimes it's intimidating for people to talk to attorneys, but I really enjoyed the conversation with them. They were very down to earth and they gave us some great tips.
And what I found is we had talked a little bit, chatted briefly, and said, what I found interesting about them, because I agree sometimes attorneys can be a little intimidating, but both of them I felt had a very genuine sense of children and really the process that people are going through. And I think that's really important when you're working with an attorney because you're very emotional. It's very difficult. You feel very isolated. It's not a good situation to be in, but you want to be working with someone who has a sense of what you're experiencing and going through. And one of the interesting questions, so we can kind of kick this off, we asked them, how do you pick an attorney in the first place? And I said, it's a really interesting question because for a lot of us as civilians, you grab the first person because you feel desperate or you're not quite sure what to do. So in the background to this question, we explained a little bit, we've had experts on the show, and I forget the number exactly. It was either 14 or 15 attorneys, and most of us have had more than one. So one of the questions that we asked them, what's the firm's process of engaging with an attorney and how do you pick a big one, a good one? Because another expert had said, there are attorneys and then there are attorneys. So I think that was what we were trying to look for as far as their answer. And that was my thoughts as far as that first question. What do you think, Kendra?
Yeah, I think it goes hand in hand with you hire slow and fire fast. And I think that's the same way you need to do with an attorney. Like you said, we're all in that desperate mode, right? When you're going through a divorce, you need to step back and take a deep breath and interview several people. Marcie said, interview several attorneys, get somebody that you're comfortable with because you need to take it really slow and make sure you get the right person so you don't go through 14 or 15 or 7 or 2 or whatever it might take. And, something else Marcy said, there's different types of attorneys you can hire. Sometimes you need a therapist and to hold your hand and just know that's a really expensive therapist every time you call them. I was in that position at one point. And then, there could be what she called the hard hitter. You might need somebody that's just really, there to get business done. And I think sometimes if you're that really emotional person, you almost need that hard hitter to put it in perspective for you. You almost need that opposite person, kind of like opposites attract in a marriage. And I think that, if you are the hard hitter, you might need more of the therapist or the more the empathetic or to show that emotional side. So I don't know. I was kind of torn on that because that's tough. You don't know what you need, right? I think you're drawn to the person that you want to be with. You want that therapist. You want somebody to listen to you when you're going through the hard time. Or if you want to go in and you're digging your nails in, you want that person that's just going to go bloods and guts and glory, right? But I think you might need the opposite person. I don't know. I was thinking a lot on this, Mick. This is a tough question.
Yep. And a couple of thoughts come to me. So if I call the attorney, ring, ring, and I talk for 30 seconds, guess what? They just billed me for 15 minutes. because they bill in 15-minute increments. So your calls, you better make sure that they are worthwhile calls because it's pricey. Now, that's one thought. And I also was impressed with the fact that one of the things that Rick said was if you want to go to someone else, get a second opinion. So if it were a health decision, for example, that's exactly what you would do. And if you go to 2 or 3, they often will come back to him. And I said, "That's right. That's the kind of attorney you want because what they're confirming is what they were told initially was accurate. You are gonna get a good attorney, and the other people are gonna say the same thing." So that would reassure them to come back to Rick, and that was one of the things he said. And then the other one was, of course, I asked him directly about, okay, what was the mistakes that I made? Because I had 2 attorneys, and it was my idealistic thought that, okay, this is completely an injustice. I'm gonna change the world and I'm gonna make a difference. And so when I thought strategically about what attorneys to get, I was thinking of the larger plan. And what really they're trying to say, I think, is take your 3 top ideas perhaps and concentrate on those. And that way, the little things that come up won't really matter as much as your mission of accomplishing the task that you really are set yourself for.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Marcy made a comment something about seeing the forest through the trees, and so looking at a big picture, if I'm referencing that correctly. And then
Mhm.
the other thing that Rick said was, you get what you pay for. Don't go with the cheapest thing either, right? Because if you hire the cheapest lawyer out there, you're gonna get what you pay for. I mean, you really need to factor your life. It's and Marcy called it an investment in your future. So if you are the BMW, are you going to take yourself to Joe Schmo shop down the road and hope that he does it right? Or are you going to take it to a BMW certified factory warranty, you know, shop? So I think you need to invest in your future.
And envision something along the lines was envision what your future should be like and what do you want it to be. And that way, when you're retaining an attorney, you're also envisioning your future and what kind of life you would like to lead post divorce, post custody situation.
Now, Mick, that is really hard. I thought about that too, right? Because when you're in that panic mode, and some of us have an easy divorce, but we're talking high conflict divorces in this situation. So when you are, emotions are high, you're deep in all of the daily grind of it, every little thing that's said or heard or done or whatnot. I
Mhm.
think it's hard to step back and think about what do you want in your future because you're so in the now. It's hard to think. So if my advice would be anything from what they had said, when you're hiring an attorney, make sure it's someone that keeps pushing you to your future and what you want and seeing that bigger picture rather than getting in the daily grind with you.
We had another question, or the protection orders were used in custody situations, and what was the upshot of that discussion?
Yeah. So that was a really good question too. And I took away several different things from that. Ultimately, they said that they are being used inappropriately to get custody.
Mhm.
They didn't give a percentage of what number of cases, but it seems higher post-COVID, as Rick referred to, than what they were seeing pre-COVID. And, something else that he said is we have created a system that allows it to be a weapon or to be used to be weaponized. So we've done this. So protection orders aren't really there for the ones that need it anymore. It's unfortunately used against somebody and you have to play defense or make sure you try to avoid that situation at all cost.
And I think here's the upshot of in some ways, who wants to be in this situation to say that something unfortunate happened if they don't provide a protection order? And I think that's the reluctance on behalf of the attorneys and the judges who are granting them because somebody has stepped up and come forward. And what they don't want to have happen is to protect themselves and their reputation to say, yes, we're going to grant them. But that means just what you're saying, and this is what they indicated. Well, now it's been weaponized, and now it's gone beyond what it was really intended to do because what we had them in first place was for these really horrible situations where people desperately needed protection from somebody. Now it just has become a tool and toolbox to go after a person that you don't care for.
Yeah, and you gotta think about the other side too, right? So if you have a protection order served against you, it's going to keep you away from your children for long periods of time, whatever that might be. Might be a couple months, it might be up to a year until you see court, I think Rick referenced. And so it's really hard after that to gain custody because you've lost that communication time with your children. And at that point, then you're almost, reinvesting into counseling and reunification counseling. And that's all required by the court, Marcy said.
And it means that you might have supervised visit as opposed to actual real parenting time. So everybody knows it's a really artificial situation. But once the accusation has been leveled, it's really, really difficult to say, okay, I'm going to take that accusation away and show my innocence. Because unfortunately, the way that most people think is that if there's been an accusation, they think, well, there must be some sort of guilt attached to it and maybe they just didn't find it. And that's unfortunate, but I think that's the conclusion that a lot of people draw as a result of a protection order.
Yeah. And not just people, right? It's the judge and the guardian ad litems who represent the children. And they don't want to make those decisions based on making the wrong one, right? So they would err on the
Mhm.
side of caution and saying, "Oh, even though maybe they were proven that they were innocent and nothing happened, we don't want to take that chance and putting the children back with that parent and something does happen, it comes back on us." So unfortunately, that's the situation you're in.
You know, that's it's unfortunate. So we've created a system in which the system is not completely workable and not completely accurate and it's not really effective. And that's really the thing that I think sometimes we talk about, where the legislators come in and say, let's change the legislation because unless they do that, these things are going to be used consistently and unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. So I think that leads us into our third question that we asked
Yes.
them is
Mhm.
what happens when the other parent takes the child and runs? What can you do? What precautions, provisions can you put into place, and what can you do if it does happen?
Yes. And that's an interesting question for a lot of us. And personally, it affects me as well, too. So finding, going back to question one, and the attorneys and where are they? So if you're working with a small law firm and a local law firm, can they help you if the child or children are absconded somewhere else? The answer is no. So when you're looking for an attorney, then you find a firm in which they have presence in other places. So, for example, Cordell and Cordell, 42 states or 300 attorneys, they have the comprehensive approach that if someone is in Pennsylvania and they go to Ohio, well, they have presence in Ohio, vice versa, or they have a larger presence in other places. So unless you have those connections and it happens, you may be out of luck. And that's a consideration to take in place. So, what they had cautioned against is that be aware of these things. And if you have some reason to think that there is a person who might do this, find a law firm which also has a presence in those other places. So, for example, in my situation, we were living in Pennsylvania, but there were connections and family in California where the child ended up and so that would have been something if I had been thinking and seeing a red flag, well, possibly going to California. So when they had said this, and this is even worse, of course, is what happens if a person gets close to a border, which means then they're going over an international line, Canada, Mexico, somewhere else in the world. And this has happened to people as well too. So if you have that connection and the possibility, you need to think of this when retaining an attorney as well, that somebody might be taking off. I started the novel. It's always the first line. I go, no parent prepares for a child to be taken. I go, yeah, because it's not something you think about. But if you are involved with someone and in this type of relationship, you need to keep that idea in mind.
Yeah, and I think that goes to Mick is if you have a firm that is in multiple states, it's nice because you have to know where that parent took the child. And then you also have to file that complaint with that court in that state of where they took the child. I didn't think about that until Marcy referenced it. So that was very interesting. The other thing I wanted to address, and you kind of addressed on one of them, but the red flags. So if you are married to somebody who has family in another state, like your situation, that was a red flag. So that was one thing that you need to keep in mind. Another one is if they don't have a job in the current city. That was another one. Or if they reference that they're going to take the child, do not blow that off. They could take the child. Do not just say, "Oh, they were just saying it in the heat of the moment." No, you need to really take that into consideration that that could happen.
Yeah, so if they have local connections, and so friends, family, jobs, all the kinds of things that would tie a person to a local community, if they do not have them, or if they have the possibility and option of going somewhere else and they have those connections, think about it because might be indeed what they're planning and thinking all along. So I'm here temporarily and I've got my escape valve, and there's the escape valve. So that's a red flag that if a person is not putting down roots, as they might say, in they have roots somewhere else, or they have family, friends, and they feel tied to another area. Make sure you're aware of those issues.
Great way to say that. Putting roots down if they don't have roots. That's a great way to say it. And Marcy very empathetically said it takes a very long time to figure out. So don't expect it to come back, to be resolved, I guess, within a week or so. It's going to take months. It's going to take a very long time. And your best bet is to have some provisions defined in your court orders, putting limits on where each of you can go and not go, right? And I thought something that they brought up that I was not familiar with was certain countries, and I think they referred to them as hay countries.
It's The Hague, yes, it's a city, and the Hague Convention is there are certain countries that have agreed to the Hague Convention provisions, which means that if a child is absconded somewhere else, if they're a signer to the Hague Convention, that country will also assist getting that child or children back. But if they're not a signer to the Hague Convention, we got a problem because they don't recognize the legality of that situation.
Yeah. And that was huge. So something else that to be aware of.
And how many people think of these things before they get involved, you know?
Yeah, not me.
A lot of us don't. I mean, the Hague Convention, I mean, come on. But,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
it's
You
not
need to know
common
some
enough.
of your legislation, right, I guess, at that point and
Yeah.
need to figure out what countries are connected. I didn't think about that.
There years and years ago, there's a movie, I think it was Sally Fields that was in that her child was or children, I forget which, were taken to the Middle East, and this was part of the situation, that there's it was basically lawless. So, how is she supposed to get the kids back when these folks don't recognize anything from another country? And that was the situation that she was in.
Mhm. Yeah. I think I remember that movie. It predates me, but I did see it, Mick.
But I was very, very young when I saw it.
So, I think that leads us to question number 4,
Right.
where we were asking them to address how you enforce court orders that are broken. And again, this question, they had several different answers that were very interesting. I think one of it was making sure your attorney has clear language and it's not open to interpretation. So I know that's extremely hard to do, but I always tell people you almost have to be your own attorney as well. Even though you have an attorney and you trust your attorney, I trusted attorneys that guided me way off path. And from the very beginning, I just assumed that attorneys knew what they were doing. So you almost need to be familiar with the law, be familiar with how to write a motion, be familiar with the language to put in it and not to put in it, and be very, very, very specific.
There's a concept, an idea, and it's called the four walls of the law. And when it comes to language, what they're trying to indicate is think of it as having four walls. So, in other words, the text and the words that are in the guidance have to be inside that wall. Anything that is outside that you thought, you implied, you considered, you assumed it doesn't work. And that's really what they're trying to say. It's the four walls of the law that it's got to be stated clearly and it's got to be said so that there's no misinterpretation. So the person said, well, I just thought, well, that doesn't work because it's not in the language that's being used. Another thing is a parenting plan. So sometimes it will come up in a co-parenting plan that if you have a co-parenting plan and it's in a legal document, make sure that it's in those so-called four walls that's stated clearly, and also every party to it understands it correctly and clearly.
Yeah. Good point. Good point, Mick. And I think the other thing to think about is even though you can enforce court orders through contempts, the judge might not hear them for I was reviewing the notes and we had in there, I think Rick and Marcie referenced maybe once a week the judge would hear contempts. Sometimes you get every 2 weeks, sometimes you get 2 to 3 months, sometimes you get 3 to 6 months, and some judges choose to push off the contempts if you already have a scheduled court hearing and here's everything at the end. And so that could be a year or so. So just keep that in mind. Your contempts might not be heard. It's based on judge's decision.
And it almost is arbitrary. That's what it sounds like, right? So a lot of us as parents were saying, that I'm not a real parent in many ways because whatever time I think developmentally, like everyone will say about kids, and it's definitely the case, you blink and they're 18. So you don't realize that when they're young, but you are losing actual real parenting time depending on the maturity level of that child. So whether they're speaking or they're riding bikes or going to school or having issues as a preteen, as a teenager, whatever stage they are in, because of this time gap, you're simply lost out on that, and the child loses out on that. So the different parenting styles, because I think men and women, mothers and fathers parent differently, but I would always argue they need both. And what they're losing out on and how the child is harmed is the fact that they're losing out on the insights and the wisdom that you get from both parents. And all of a sudden, 3 months, 6 months, a year goes by and you don't get it back. It's gone forever.
Yeah. That touches me personally because I've experienced that.
Understood. Yes.
Yes. And the other thing that wasn't addressed specifically with Marcy and Rick, but for someone to keep in mind if they're going through a divorce is if you're filing a contempt, even though it's charged through the attorney, if you go file it on your own, you still have some charge. So even though you write some type of court order, whether it's your divorce decree, whether it's your separation agreement, your parenting agreement, whatever it might be, and you have that filed with the court, in order to enforce it, you have to file a motion for contempt. In order to do that, there's a charge associated. In Ohio, it's based by county. My county charges $200 per motion. So, in addition to the time that you pay an attorney to write up the contempt and file the motion, you're probably in $1,000 or more in just filing the contempt to try to get the judge to hear that contempt and hoping that they will do something about it to stop that action immediately so you don't lose that time with the children.
Yeah, it always reminds me of those little stories that come across my mind. The time when mom didn't give our child a security blanket, and I said, I got to get that security blanket. That ended up for just that, and this was back in the 90s, cost me $600. So for this $2 item of a blanket, that cost $600. So when you're having the time benefit analysis and the cost benefit analysis, this is something to think about. It's going to be very pricey for every little tiny thing that you think, and you really have to weigh, is it really worth it? Because, yeah, these are pricey items and there's a time limit, a time bound element to it. So you always have to keep those things in mind.
Yes. And if you're lucky enough that your contempt does get heard, make sure you document everything. That was another thing they pointed out.
They
So
did.
whether it is you go try to pick up the child because they didn't bring them for parenting time, and when you go pick up the child, you were told no, you can file a police report just stating, from another professional saying that no, you don't have to call the police to the situation, but you can just file a report so that you have it documented saying I did not get my child. They refused to go with me. Any other documentation, communication, document it through text message or, through your court app that they require you to use or email, but no phone calls. Document everything you can so that you have all the documentation ready for that contempt so that you can get that charge put against them if and when it's heard.
And it's the idea of not necessarily in a phone, which is what they said, but document, document, document. If it's any way possible in some sort of paper form or a third party agency, say police or someone else, that there's also a record. So any action that you would like to take, if it's documented by someone else, then you can always refer to that. And that's the way. So I mean, yes, keep in mind, document every single thing that you think is necessary to do.
Yes. Yes. And, I just wanted to bring up at the end of the conversation with Rick and Marcy, I was kind of asking them because I know Supreme Court has some influence over the local jurisdictions. And so what they do is they actually have guidelines. So it's nothing that the local laws have to follow, or the local court systems have to follow, but it's guidelines. And so in Ohio, it's 18 months. So as far as filing for a divorce is the guideline that Supreme Court would like for you to be done with your divorce with kids is 18 months. Now, Pennsylvania was a little different.
Mhm.
And they can't force either side to go into litigation until 1 year of separation has been filed and adhered to.
So a little interesting interplay between Marcy and Rick and the difference between Ohio and Pennsylvania. So this also has to do with sort of get your background, get your understanding of where you are and the states and the local issues that you're going to deal with. Because as we saw from the conversation, Pennsylvania was not as good a shape as Ohio is. So who would know? The states are right next to each other. You think they're fairly similar or they're the same. Nope, they're not. Do your research, find out.
And these would all be great questions to ask an attorney when you're interviewing and find out that information. So a great question would be, so what is the Supreme Court guidelines in our state to get a divorce? Because you're rushing in thinking you're going to get it done and you're going to move on with your life in 6 months. Probably not happening. So just be prepared for that. And then asking them how they view the big picture versus all the little things. Are you going to fight over? I think you referenced the toothpaste squeeze, right? Are you going to fight over all the little things? I know there was one case that one of my attorneys told me about where they were literally fighting over the silverware. And it took them 2 years to come to an agreement on the silverware. And I'm like, really? So big picture, big picture.
Yeah, and I said the reason I say it because like relationships, it's the things that when you first get into a relationship, of course, everything they do is cute and funny and what have you. But bear in mind that after a while, the honeymoon period is over, and the things that you found were cute at the beginning are not so cute anymore. And so you can't get distracted by those things. The things that are little and they're trivial, make sure you have a proper perspective. They really are trivial, and keep your eye on the major goal that you want to, and don't get distracted by all these little things because it's easy to do. You get emotional, and they're going down a rabbit hole.
Yes, exactly. And I thinking about that, do you know how much it cost them to fight over the silverware or any kitchen things? They could have bought probably a half of a new house by then, right?
Yeah. Put it in perspective, I guess, is the point. That is it really
Yes.
that important? I mean, in the larger scheme of things, it really doesn't. And when it comes down to the states and the differences, and I say now I understand how Pennsylvania was not really a great place, and in many ways, it's because it's a drawback in some ways, and it's the difference between states that have not really worked themselves through that issue, and that's what took so long, and, who would know? I mean, I certainly didn't do that kind of research because I would say it's gonna happen to the other guy, it's not gonna happen to me, right?
Yeah. Well, and like you said, some states are very progressive and some are not. I will follow it up to say we now have a new House bill assigned number
Good.
for now. So I believe it's House Bill 14. So I'm very excited about that. So now we move into presenting it in front of a committee. And I'm not sure if that committee will be the same committee we presented to before or not. So we're waiting to get that assigned. But again, everything takes time. And I think that's what you just need to realize with this, right? Divorce courts, filing things, everything's going to take time. So relax, take a deep breath.
And one of the things we asked Marcy there again towards the tail end of the interview, because she did weigh in on the Ohio current legislation. And what we always tell people is that be aware of the legislation that's current in your respective states because they are working. We're in new legislative year, a new legislative session. So anything that you want to see change, get involved locally or on the state level because they are coming up as Ohio has got a current issue.
Yes, we're crossing our fingers. Pennsylvania will eventually, maybe one day, get there for all those that you left behind.
I kid the Pennsylvanians. I say there's a saying I would say to everybody: if it was good enough for my grandfather, it's good enough for me. A little bit behind the time. It's the only place in the country that I've seen where they put on the exit signs on the highways what was the old exit number. I go, Why would you put the old exit number? It's the new one. Come on, folks, wake up."
Oh my.
Honestly, I love Pennsylvania. I really do. There's one or two things.
Yes, yes. Well, Mick, it was good chatting with you. I think it was good follow up. I really enjoyed Marcie and Rick's conversation with us, and I hope our listeners took away a lot of valuable information.
Phenomenal. We really appreciate the time and effort put in by them and Cordell, and Joe was very gracious of allowing them to come on our show. So we thank them for that, and Joe personally. We really appreciate it. So as a wrap up, we want to tell people about sponsorships where we got things in mind. We'd love to see people helping and jumping in if you get value from the show. So Facebook ads, we'd like some magazine promotions, YouTube promos. We have some administrative tasks as we've grown. We also have some things that get a little bit overwhelming. So if you know any sponsors or would like to sponsor the Aftermath podcast, we'd love to hear from you. And if you know experts, we'd also like to hear from who you think might be a good guest on the podcast. So thanks for your time again, Kindra. It was phenomenal. Great
Yes.
session. Hope everybody goes back and listens because it was a great interview.
Yeah, hearing from them directly is so much more impactful than us. Although we're great speakers, Mick.
We are phenomenal. Let's pat ourselves on the back. We're awesome. Like we were saying, it's he said, she said, but you know what? We sometimes find a lot of agreement. That's the whole point, folks. Be kind. I said, quote from Plato, which I love, be kind to everyone you meet because everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Yes, yes, we can come together. We can be companions. Absolutely.
Truth.
All right. So until next time, it's the Aftermath signing off. Thanks, Kendra, for your time. We'll see you next time. Day is full.